Here, on our channel, the stories of people from different eras, different walks of life, different destinies, come alive once more. Each of them has their own path, their own quiet thread of fate, woven from circumstances, from hardships, from choices made in silence, and from those moments when life itself seemed to whisper which way to go. And before we gently step into their world tonight, make sure to subscribe. And later, when your mind is calm and the story settles inside you, you can share your thoughts in the comments below. And now, we continue. There are stories that do not begin with thunder or grand events. They begin softly, with small things, with details that seem insignificant at first glance, but inside them lies an entire universe. Stories about people who never chose to be heroes, who simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward, step by quiet step. Lives like these unfold slowly, like a flower opening one delicate petal at a time. Each layer reveals a new secret, a new sorrow, a new joy. This is a story from a time when the world felt a little different. London greeted a young boy with a blend of scents. First, the sour breath of the Thames rising from the docks, reaching in here, and to the city where his father kept up selling writing supplies. Then came the faint, sweet smell of glued paper that the father unwrapped each morning as he prepared the goods for the day. And, finally, that special, unmistakable scent of printing ink, seeping through the thin wall from the house next door, where the workshop of Master William Nechayev was humming with life. The boy was born in 1832, when Fleet Street had already become the beating heart of the Empire's printing world. Here, the presses thundered. Here, the air smelled of lead and linseed oil. Here, words were given physical form, heavy, metallic, powerful enough to outlive the ones who wrote them. There, flat above the father's shop, was tiny, one small room for the three of them, with a narrow bed near the window that looked out into a well-like courtyard where strangers. Shirts always hung to dry, and someone's children always seemed to be shouting and laughing. The father sold pens and paper, ink and sealing wax. The goods were honest, but the profit was thin. Customers were all kinds, clerks in worn coats counting every penny, law students carelessly tossing a shilling onto the counter, and, on rare days, gentlemen in fine coats buying expensive paper with watermarks, never haggling, never rushing. The boy learned to read people by their hands. The poor had fingers stained with ink. The wealthy had clean, well-kept hands, smooth as polished ivory. When he turned 8, his father finally allowed him to handle the shop's goods, to move stacks of paper without bending the corners, to arrange ink bottles by size, to sort the pens by quality. The work was repetitive. His small arms tired quickly, but he never complained. Understood. There, family survived on these little things, on every sheet sold, on every coin saved. In the evenings, when the shop closed, he would press his ear to the thin wall separating their home from the printing workshop. Behind that wall lived another world. Metal clattered against metal. Voices rose over the roar of the press. Someone cursed, someone laughed. Sometimes he heard a soft, wet thump. A sheet of paper receiving its ink. He had never seen the process, but in his mind, he could already imagine how the letters aligned into words, how the words settled into paragraphs, how order was born from the chaos of metal blocks. His mother noticed his fascination and shook her head. She kan shop clerkarbete yet, a proper fiske clerk in some respectable firm. It was a face, dear. Printers, she believed, were too free-spirited, too dangerous. They read everything they printed, and reading, as she used to say, ruins a simple man's character. But the boy didn't listen. Something in him was drawn, pulled, toward that world behind the wall, where metal turned into thought. Then came the year 1840, and disaster followed. His father, trying to save the family business, bought a large shipment of fine Italian paper on credit. Expensive, delicate, risky, but customers didn't come. The season was bad, or maybe the father misjudged the price. Zedem grew the supply payment. Court was threatened. They had to close the shop. Everything was sold for almost nothing. The family was left with empty shelves and colder nights. The boy, nearly 9 by then, remembered how his father sat at the table, his forehead resting in his hands. How his mother cried silently against the wall, and how the whole room smelled of stale air and hopelessness. They needed money, they needed work. His father went to see William. The printer was a strong man in his 50s, with broad shoulders and arms stained with black ink up to the elbows. He received visitors in a small office smelling of tobacco and lead. The father spoke long, nervously, asking William to take the boy as an apprentice. William looked at the child for a while, then asked if he could read. The boy nodded. He asked if he feared hard work. The boy shook his head. William agreed. The boy's first days in the print shop felt like descending into a new world. Everything here had its own order, its own rhythm. The letters were kept in cases, wooden drawers with hundreds of tiny compartments. Each character had its place, and mixing them up was one of the gravest sins in the craft. The apprentice had to memorize the layout completely, so his hand would reach the right letter without ever needing to look. Lowercase letters lived in the lowercase. Uppercase letters in the uppercase. That is where these terms were born. The boy learned quickly. His fingers were still too weak for the heavier types, but he made up for it with diligence. He woke earlier than everyone else to sweep the workshop, and stayed later than the others to sort the type back into the cases. Letter by letter, each one to its rightful place. It was like a meditation, almost a prayer. William said nothing, but he noticed. He wasn't generous with praise, yet he never scolded without reason. His workshop was one of the finest on Fleet Street. They printed newspapers, pamphlets, books. Work never stopped. The presses never cooled. The journeymen were experienced, loud, superstitious. They didn't like newcomers, but the boy never intruded. He learned by watching, quiet and attentive. Soon they trusted him with simple tasks, first to bring paper, then to mix ink by hand, combining soot with linseed oil until the consistency felt just right. The ink had to be neither too thick nor too runny. They tested it by rubbing a tiny drop between their fingertips. If it spread smoothly, it was ready. If not, start again. The boy grew to love the press. It was a machine both simple and astonishing at the same time. A wooden frame, metal rollers, a heavy iron lever that pressed the paper into the inked form. The freshly composed letters were locked tightly into place, the form brushed with ink, a sheet of paper laid gently on top. And with a slow, steady pull of the lever, a miracle appeared. Black lines bloomed across the white surface, quiet, disciplined, strokes that moments ago were only loose fragments of metal. A small magic, accessible to anyone who knew how to coax it into being. Printers carried their own rituals, their quiet superstitions whispered from master to apprentice. La Danforêt told Miss Fortune instantly. Then, followed by 3 soft spits over the left shoulder to chase away the bad luck. No printer would begin an important job on a Monday. The day was considered heavy, unlucky, resistant to the hand. And the very first impression of the day, the moment that crisp sheet was lifted to the light, had to be inspected by the master himself, if the page came out clean. No blotches, no smudges. The whole shift breathed easier. Good fortune would follow. The boy absorbed these rules along with the scent of ink, as if they were part of the craft itself, not written, but lived. He earned only a handful of pence a week. Just enough for bread, a sliver of cheese, sometimes, if fortune smiled, a small piece of salted pork. Almost everything he brought home to his mother. She no longer cried. She only shook her head slowly and tucked the coins into an old tea tin she kept under the bed. His father found work as a porter at a warehouse, but the years of strain had worn him down. Each night his chest rattled with deep, painful coughs, and his mother brewed bitter herbs that smelled of wormwood and winter soil. The boy grew up among letters and ink. His hands hardened, covered with tiny cuts from the sharp edges of metal. His nails darkened permanently, stained with lead that no soap could remove. But he never complained, because in that noisy, chemical-scented workshop, he felt something he had never known before, a sense of belonging. His existence mattered here. His work had weight. Whenever he found a brief moment of rest, he would study the fresh impressions, lines of type forming sentences, sentences forming stories. Arrête slowly with Angrim. Parliament, news, shop ads, poems printed in cheap booklets. Through these pages, a wider world unfolded, distant, dangerous, beautiful. A world that began to call to him. William noticed this curiosity and did not interfere. Once, he even gave the boy an old, tattered volume of the Book of Ballads. The boy read it by candlelight until sleep claimed him, his face resting on the yellowed pages. Heroes and villains lived there, betrayals and hopes, love and justice. Everything seemed simpler, clearer, as if the world itself once followed a more honest pattern. And the boy liked to imagine, even if only for a moment, that somewhere, in some forgotten time, life truly was that way. Years of apprenticeship passed slowly. The boy grew. His shoulders broadened. His fingers learned confidence and precision. He memorized the type cases so well his hands reached for letters without conscious thought. He sensed the rhythm of the press, when to press harder, when to ease the lever to avoid tearing the sheet. He learned to judge paper by its weight, ink by its scent. The craft seeped into him until it felt not learned, but inherited. But he also noticed things no one spoke of. Sometimes, late at night, when the main work was finished, strange visitors slipped inside the shop. They carried manuscripts that William hid quickly in his desk. When the workshop emptied, the master stayed behind with only his most trusted journeyman, and again the press would start, but softer, secretive, almost whispering. By morning, every trace of that work vanished. The boy never asked. He understood, instinctively, that some questions were not meant to be spoken aloud. In London of the 1840s, the printed word was a weapon. Authorities monitored the presses. Censors smothered unwanted voices. Yet underground printing thrived, pamphlets denouncing the government, rebellious leaflets, forbidden books, all whispered into existence by small workshops like this one. The boy felt a strange mix of pride and fear. Pride that he was part of something larger, something hidden and dangerous, and fear because the consequences were real. Police raids were common, presses were confiscated, printers arrested, punishments were harsh, but William seemed untouchable, careful, clever, connected to the right people. His shop prospered, and by the time the boy turned 13, he was a true apprentice, more skilled than some journeymen. William began trusting him with important work, setting complex passages, checking impressions, tasks that demanded accuracy bordering on obsession. And that obsession would become, in time, both his greatest gift and his deepest wound. It would make him a master and isolate him. It would lead him toward a mystery and cost him dearly. But for now, at 13, he was simply a boy working too hard, breathing in ink and metal dust, dreaming quiet dreams. Fleet Street thrummed like a living creature. News traveled through it like blood through veins. Here, the future was printed at dawn and read by thousands by noon. The boy was just a small cog in this machine. But he already dreamed of more, of his own press, his own workshop, his own voice. Those dreams kept him warm on cold nights as he trudged home exhausted, smelling of ink and iron. His father died that winter. The cough that haunted him finally turned fatal. The boy supported his mother alone now. Iwaj grew almost as much as a young journeyman's salary. Enough for two. Modest, but enough. The print shop became his true home. He knew every board in the floor, every drawer in the type cases. Here, he was someone, not a poor boy from a ruined family, but a craftsman. Apprenti. And somewhere far ahead, quietly, unseen, his destiny was gathering its pieces. A strange pamphlet he would one day print, a mystery he would be forced to unravel, a price he would pay, but all of that lay in the future. For now, he was simply a young man breathing the scent of ink and dreaming of owning a press of his own. Adulthood did not arrive suddenly. It settled slowly into his bones through calluses on his palms, through 12-hour days at the press, through the right to speak among the journeymen when they argued about paper weight. He was 19 when William first called him not an apprentice, but a journeyman. There was no ceremony, no speech, just a nod toward a perfect impression and a quiet, good work. It meant more than any diploma. The business grew. William bought a second press, a more modern machine with a smoother, stronger mechanism. Orders increased. Not just newspapers and advertisements, but books. Small runs for private publishers. Work that demanded the highest precision. The book-setting work was far more delicate than printing newspapers. It required a more complex layout, a careful selection of typefaces, and the discipline to maintain perfect uniformity from page to page, and the young typesetter. He handled it all better than the older apprentices. His obsession with detail, something others dismissed as a strange quirk, became his greatest advantage here. He could spend hours aligning lines until the spacing between the words felt absolutely perfect. Checking each individual letter before placing it, making sure it wasn't bent, worn down, or stained, his prints came out flawless. No smudges, no blurred edges, no crooked impressions. But such perfection had its cost. The work consumed nearly all his time, leaving little space for anything resembling a life beyond the print shop walls. While the other apprentices slipped out in the evenings to taverns, dice games, or the company of cheerful girls, he stayed by the press, redoing anything that, to his eye, was anything short of ideal. William didn't mind. Shoddy work cost money, and time, even lost time, could always be regained. On Besid, no problem. The apprentices' wages were enough not merely to survive, but to put a little aside. His mother moved into a better room, one with its own entrance, and no mold creeping along the walls. He brought her tea, sugar, and sometimes a piece of good meat for Sunday. She accepted the gifts quietly, but he could read the truth in her eyes, pride. Her son had climbed out of poverty with his own hands. And then, in the spring of 1850, something happened that changed his life. A manuscript was brought to the print shop, a political pamphlet. The text was sharp, accusatory, condemning parliamentary reforms and calling ministers traitors to the people. Printing such a thing in a legal workshop was inviting trouble. William took the manuscript, said he would think about it, and dismissed the customer. That evening, when the official day's work had ended, the master gathered his most trusted apprentices. There were 4 of them, including the young typesetter. William placed the manuscript on the table and asked plainly who among them was willing to help print forbiddance material. The pay would be generous. But the risk was serious. 3 agreed immediately. The young typesetter hesitated. He remembered the arrests, the stories of confiscations, and of printers disappearing into prisons. But William's expectant gaze made refusal feel like cowardice. And worse, the loss of the master's respect, which he valued more than anything. His agreement came with difficulty, but it came. They worked at night, behind locked doors. The windows were covered with heavy cloth so that no light could escape. The press was muffled with rags to soften the thunder of the mechanism. They set the type quickly and printed a small run, 200 copies. The young typesetter was responsible for the quality. His hands trembled, but every page came out immaculate. By dawn, the pamphlets had dried, packed into sacks, and carried out through the back entrance. The customer paid in ringing coins. William divided the money evenly. The young typesetter received more than he usually earned in an entire month. The coins felt heavy and cold in his pocket, almost burning, but he did not refuse them. And so began his path into the world of underground printing. The orders came irregularly, once a month, sometimes less. Always at night, always in secret. They printed political leaflets, banned religious texts, even indecent poems that censorship refused to allow. The work was dangerous and thrilling. The young typesetter felt the pun, almost heroic. They were giving a voice to those whom the authorities tried to silence. But fear clung to him still. Eleanor began to speak of loneliness. He left before she woke, returned after she was asleep. They saw each other in fragments, a few minutes in the morning, a brief Sunday meal, Their conversations shrank into simple exchanges. How are you? Fine. How do you feel? Tired. Silence. A pause that grew heavier each week. He didn't notice the wall rising between them. Or noticed, but didn't know what to do. Pourquoi lire tasks solution? Relationships were foggy, fragile, requiring time and presence he no longer had. Eleanor learned to live with the ghost of a husband, a man who appeared briefly, ate, slept, and vanished again. In autumn, their son was born. The birth was difficult. The midwife barely managed. The young printer sat through the night behind the wall, listening to his wife's cries, feeling helpless. When the midwife finally brought him the infant, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, he held the child in his arms and felt a strange mixture, pride, fear, something close to panic. He was now responsible not just for himself. Their son grew quickly. Eleanor cared for him entirely. The father helped little. He didn't know how, was afraid of doing something wrong. Better to earn an extra shilling than to fumble with swaddling clothes. Eleanor didn't argue, but a quiet exhaustion settled in her eyes, not physical, but soul deep. She loved her husband, but the love was becoming a habit, a duty. The print shop thrived. William expanded, hired new workers. The young printer received a promotion, now supervising complex orders, responsible for quality. His wage increased. Life seemed to be on the right path. Work, family, stability. What more could one ask for? Yet, inside him something restless stirred, a subtle unease, as if something important was slipping away in the routine of daily labor. Eleanor was drifting from him. His son grew without knowing his father. Work consumed everything. He felt it, but could not stop. Stopping meant admitting something was wrong, and that admission terrified him. At night, when sleep refused to come, he would lie beside his wife and think of the future. His own workshop was still just a dream. He needed a few more years of savings, then a space to rent, a press to buy. A steady flow of orders. The path was long, but possible. He only had to keep working, keep focusing, never falter. He didn't know that this very obsession would one day nearly destroy everything he had built. That he would be forced to choose between his craft and his family, and that the price of perfection would be far higher than he could ever imagine. But now, at 21, he was simply an apprentice, a husband, a father who worked much and slept little. Sometimes, returning home at dawn, he would glance over his shoulder, certain he was being watched. The police truly were hunting underground, presses. Raids were frequent. Printers were arrested, presses destroyed. Punishments ranged from heavy fines to prison sentences. William was careful. He had connections. People warned him about upcoming inspections. The legal part of the print shop ran perfectly, papers immaculate, orders legitimate. The secret work was concealed so skillfully that even a sudden search would reveal nothing. The young typesetter learned this double life, admiring William's mastery. That summer, however, brought something else, someone else. Her name was Eleanor. They met at the annual Bookbinders' Fair, a gathering where craftsmen of the book trade displayed their work and searched for partners, clients, and inspiration. The young typesetter came on William's behalf to negotiate a binding order. Eleanor worked in her father's workshop. She was about 20. Her hands were quick and strong, Bookbinding required real physical strength. She stitched the signatures, fastened the covers, and pressed designs into leather with gold when he stole Sherlock and smiled simply, warmly, without pretense. The business conversation soon slipped into a casual one. She asked about the print shop. He asked about the bindery. The words flowed without effort. He returned to the fair the next day, though the job was already settled. And then again. Eleanor laughed at his persistence, but didn't turn him away. She came from the same world, a craftsman's daughter who understood the weight of work and the dignity of earning a living with one's hands. That shared life, that shared struggle, drew them closer. His courtship was awkward, shy. He didn't know the words lovers use, but he knew how to set beautiful type. He printed small cards for her, ornamented with short poems on the finest paper he could find. He worked on each one with the same dedication he gave to his best orders. Eleanor kept them in a little box and sometimes showed them to her friends. By autumn it became clear they would be together. No formal proposal was needed. It was decided quietly, through shared glances, through a gentle touch of hands at each meeting. Her father approved. A typesetter, respectable, steady, skilled, a good match. The wedding was planned for spring. A but in winter summed everything. The police raided several printing houses on Fleet Street. Owners were arrested, presses seized, materials confiscated. Rumors ran through the city like wildfire. The young typesetter was sure their shop would be next. He slept poorly, jumped at every knock. But William remained calm. He burned all risky materials beforehand and halted underground work. When the police finally came, they found nothing suspicious. The shop continued operating. Yet the young typesetter never forgot that feeling, the cold, paralyzing fear. Nor did he forget how William slipped through danger untouched, almost magical in his ability to avoid harm. In the spring were married. A modest ceremony, a few relatives, co-workers, a simple meal at a tavern, but the young typesetter felt truly happy. He now had a wife, a future, a steady path forward. William promised him a promotion, and within a year or two, the chance of becoming a senior apprentice. And perhaps, someday, opening a workshop of his own. They rented a small room, not far from the print shop, to modest spaces in a house shared by 3 other families. A communal stove, a yard de toilette, every sound. Yet, for them, it was the beginning of a home of their own. Eleanor arranged their little world with gentle patience, and he brought in the money they needed. They did not live richly, but they did not live in poverty either. Bread, cheese porrees, a bit of meat. Warm tea with sugar in the evenings. Simple joys for simple people, the kind that make life quietly warm. Eleanor soon realized her husband was married not also belly to his work. Elle efterlit, retourned lat. Even at home his mind lingered in the print shop, speaking endlessly about paper quality, complaining about worn type. Planning new improvements for the printing process, she listened patiently. But Pite shines choice one evening, bemused by not printed. But he didn't know how. Work was not something he could leave behind like a dirty apron at the workshop door. It lived inside him, shaping the rhythm of his thoughts. Eleanor sighed softly, but she did not demand more. She knew whom she had married. The underground work resumed. William was more cautious now, but he continued accepting secret orders. The pay was good. Risk felt justified. The young printer took part in every night shift, saving every coin, dreaming of owning a press of his own one day. Eleanor didn't know the details, but she sensed the truth. One evening she asked plainly, "Are you printing forbidden things?" He didn't answer. He only looked away. She never asked again. By the time he turned 21, he had become one of the finest craftsmen in the print shop. William trusted him with the most difficult orders. His prints were considered the standard of perfection, but that very perfection began to irritate the others. They called him tedious, overly cautious. Why waste an extra hour aligning lines when the customer would never notice? Why redo a layout for one crooked letter? He could not explain. To him, it was a matter of honor. Bad work was a betrayal of the craft. Every print had to be flawless, because that was simply the right way. William only chuckled. Strangeness that brings profit isn't a flaw. 3 years had passed since he completed his apprenticeship. He had grown stronger, more confident. But with confidence came a dangerous trait, blind trust in authority. William had become an absolute figure in his mind, a master who could not be wrong, who could never act out of selfish motives. If William said something, then it must be right. If he advised something, it must be for the best. This na vite would become his Achilles' heel. But for now, he saw no danger. He worked, earned, saved for his future workshop. Eleanor became pregnant, news that brought both joy and fear. A child meant new responsibilities, new expenses. He needed to earn more. Night shifts grew more frequent. Fleet Street buzzed outside the windows. Presses thundered, letters rang, paper whispered, and life flowed on predictable and steady, until the arrival of a strange pamphlet that would change everything. But that moment was still years away. London, at that time, felt like a living organism. Each street a vein, each workshop a cell, laboring for the whole. And our printer became a small but vital part of it when he was around 22. Life gifted him the illusion of peace. Just before the trial to come, he thought everything had settled. A small family, his own workshop, a hopeful future. He had worked long for this. After years under William's guidance, he finally dared to step out on his own. He sold the small inheritance left by his mother, added the savings he'd collected for nearly a decade, and rented a half-ruined space in the back alleys of Fleet Street. The building stood in the shadow of an old publishing house. Its windows were always dusty with paper particles, and yet this felt like a quiet blessing, a sign that the place itself was meant for a printer. On the first day, as he arranged the typecases, dragged the press into position, and wiped the letters with a turpentine-scented cloth, he felt something powerful stirring inside him, fear and wonder woven together. He worked with the same obsessive devotion as always. He did everything himself, even tasks that could be given to an apprentice. He trusted no one, not the setting, not the printing, not even the selling. Eleanor, now at home with their son, supported him as best she could. though she understood that her husband was becoming not just hard-working, but consumed by his craft. Every day brought new troubles. Paper, suppliers demanding advance payment. Ink, prices rising, rent increasing. It became almost impossible for him to relax, even on holidays. And yet, strangely, it wasn't a burden. No, for him, this constant tension was a kind of quiet proof that he was alive, that he was moving, creating, breathing with purpose. Ailleurs passed, and his little workshop finally began to bring in a modest income. He printed small announcements, greeting cards, forms, humble catalogues of goods. Sometimes thin, books in soft covers, but mostly simple everyday orders, nothing dangerous, nothing forbidden. Everything clean, everything legal. En style. That old habit of walking along the edge, of leaning just a little closer to risk, never fully disappeared. It whispered to him from time to time, quietly, temptingly, especially on the day when one particular man walked into the shop. His name was Thomas Craven, a journalist, a writer, someone who often needed printing houses willing to take on controversial texts. He was about 10 years older, with a clever, observant gaze, and a tirade smile. His restraint wasn't cold. It felt like depth, like he carried stories he would never tell openly. When Espoque was come. But inside every phrase there lived a shadow of experience, not the experience of a defeated man, no, but of someone who had been hurt and therefore became unbreakable. People like him could persuade better than the loudest orators. Their meeting was accidental. Thomas ordered a small print run of articles about the poverty of working districts, brave texts, though not yet outlawed. The printe, appreciating, omissionist, agreed. The work went smoothly. Craven often visited the workshop, standing silently by the press, observing the typesetting, arguing gently about fonts, approving every correction personally. With each visit, their conversations grew longer, richer. Thomas told him about the newspaper world, a place where one careless word could cost a man his livelihood, where politicians smiled with perfect hypocrisy, and where printed words carried more power than any sword ever forged. Those evening talks, they fascinated the printer. He would walk home long after midnight, his mind full of strange, swirling thoughts. Meanwhile, his family life shifted quietly. Eleonora, though happy about her husband's success, noticed that she saw him no more often than before. He returned home late, smelling of paper dust and linseed oil. Their son grew into a quiet child, one who listened more than he spoke. Sometimes the father brought him to the workshop, showing him how iron and paper together could summon words into existence. Yet de Vingtaine pumped him away. Work filled his thoughts, and each night he would repeat the same phrase. Without effort, there can be no prosperity. He said it like a charm, a small incantation behind which he hid his exhaustion. Thomas became a frequent client. Sometimes he brought texts that stole one's breath, sharp political commentary, articles written under false names, pieces that nipped at the ankles of those in power. The printer knew he was taking risks, but the trust Thomas placed in him, it warmed something inside. And yes, there was a secret thrill, too, a quiet sense of significance. His press was no longer merely a machine. It had become part of a battle. He didn't carry weapons. He didn't give speeches. But his letters, his tiny metal letters, delivered ideas into strangers' hearts. That felt like purpose. Everything changed on one cold, wet evening in late autumn. The streets glistened with dirty water, and the few passers-by hurried beneath the dripping awnings of shop fronts. The workday was nearly over when the door opened and a man in a long cloak stepped inside. His hood hid his face. His voice was soft, almost deliberately blurred, as if he wanted to be remembered only as a shadow. He brought a small order, a thin folder tied with string. Inside were several pages filled with neat handwriting. No names. No instructions, but the bare minimum. Every page must be reproduced exactly as written. No adjustments. And above all, he must not keep the manuscript after printing. He paid immediately. The sum was generous to generous, more than any previous job, a temptation too large to refuse. The printer usually read everything carefully before typesetting, but this time he skimmed the pages quickly. The poems were strange, fragmented, repetitive, with odd phrases circling back upon themselves. There was almost no rhythm, nothing clear, only a faint feeling of unease. He assumed the author was simply eccentric. He began the work the next day. That first night, he noticed something unusual. The lines were of irregular length. Some words were arranged vertically, forming strange columns, but he couldn't tell if it was deliberate. Then the page numbers. First page 1, then page 3. 10 survey. Then suddenly 4. Completely out of order. He wanted to fix it. His craftsman's instinct demanded order. But he remembered the man's warning. No corrections. Sois les petites. Assis-toi. Something inside whispered that these oddities were intentional. But the disciplined printer in him insisted on obedience to the instructions. If he was told not to change anything, then he must not change anything. When the copies were finally ready, he delivered them himself to the location he had been given, a small bookshop that served as subtle cover for such exchanges. The old bookseller accepted the bundle without a word. He placed the printed copies into a chest, counted out the remaining payment, and nodded. It all seemed routine, and yet something cold, almost metallic, hung in the air between every gesture. On his way back, the printer regretted for the first time that he had never asked the customer's name. Dai passed. The workshop returned to its usual rhythm, until one evening he overheard a conversation in the shop across the street. A wealthy paper merchant had been found dead in his home on the western side of the city. Rumors swirled. Robbery, old dame, revanche. The printer listened absent-mindedly until the detail that struck like a needle. A newly printed poetic booklet had been found in the dead man's pocket. No author indicated. His heart jolted. he had held that very booklet in his hands. All evening, a fog of unreality surrounded him. He tried to convince himself it was coincidence. Book travel, les things, but fear began to coil quietly inside him. Thin and sticky, Eleonora noticed his pallor. She asked if something was wrong. He said he was simply tired. He lay awake that night, watching shadows shift across the ceiling, listening to the wind push ash in the fireplace. 2 days later, Thomas Craven arrived. He entered without his usual smile. He placed a newspaper on the table. The same murder, now on the front page. Thomas asked, very quietly, whether the printer had ever seen such a booklet. For a heartbeat, the printer froze. Tener or dead, and confessed he had printed it. Thomas frowned, tapping the newspaper lightly with his fingers. He said rumors were spreading. Whispers that the booklet's text might contain a coded message. The printer laughed weakly, pretending not to take it seriously. They discussed possibilities, but both men truly understood nothing. After Thomas left, the printer sat alone for a long time, staring at one of the leftover proof pages. The left column, a cluster of letters, suddenly seemed intentional. Several lines began the same way, followed by a disturbing pause. Studying it closely, he saw a pattern. Every third letter formed words. Unclear, eerie words. Names, perhaps, or adresse. His heart thudded unevenly. A killer sending messages through printed text, using him, the printer, as an unknowing accomplice. He folded the page, hid it in his desk drawer, and tried to forget. But some things cannot be forgotten. The following week, another whisper slid through Fleet Street. Another death. This time, a woman, the keeper of a boarding house for teachers, and again. Once more. A copy of the same booklet was found on her body, carefully folded. The printer finally understood. This was no coincidence. No, Annie. From that moment on, his nights dissolved into long, sleepless hours. He would sit in the dim light of an oil lamp, shuffling through the printed copies again and again, searching for patterns, tracing hidden sequences, trying to force meaning out of the silence between the letters. Sometimes he caught himself whispering words aloud, as if the sound of his own voice might unlock something the eye could not see. An old superstition among craftsmen said, every printed word lives a life of its own. Once he laughed at that, but now he felt the weight of it. The printed page did have a life, and that life was circling back to him, to the one who had given it form. Thomas returned, more tense than before. He told him the police had begun asking questions about underground printing houses. They suspected that the booklet must have been produced outside the legal publishers. The printer understood instantly they were speaking about him. Thomas urged him to destroy all traces, but the printer. He simply couldn't. The discipline of the craft, the need to understand, overpowered caution. When his family slept, He spent hours hunched over the table, moving the pages around, studying every word as if it were a key to something hidden behind a veil. And then, in one of the poems, he noticed a strange structure. The first letter of each line formed a name. He wrote it down separately. The name felt familiar. And after hours of searching his memory, he realized it was the name of the paper merchant, the first victim. À coïncidence, no. Far more names followed. Some he didn't recognize, some he did. And then the truth rushed over him like cold water. The text was a map of crimes. A map he himself had printed, and the next victim might already be chosen. That thought would not let him rest. In desperation, he went to William, the old master who had once taught him everything. Perhaps he would know what to do. But the meeting was a disappointment. William listened without expression, then sharply told him to stay out of it. The case was too dangerous, he said. He could easily fall under suspicion. There was no warmth in his voice, no concern, only a cold, firm intention to end the conversation as quickly as possible. For the first time, the printer saw something unfamiliar in the old man, a guardedness, a distant, wary chill. Returning to the workshop, he realized he was now alone with this secret. Caution whispered that he should remain silent, but conscience demandait d'action. He gathered all the proof sheets and hid them beneath a loose floorboard. He decided that if another booklet appeared, one with the same strange construction, he would know the killer had struck again. But the more he tried to build a clear logic, the deeper he fell into confusion. Eleonora watched her husband transform, his face growing leaner, his voice quieter, his nights longer. She sensed, with that delicate intuition only she possessed, that this was no longer about orders or money. She tried to speak with him several times, but he waved her off gently, afraid to drag his family into danger. Between them grew a silence, heavy, uneasy. Nothing like the quiet they once shared. Soon a new rumor spread through the city, another victim. And another booklet found at the scene, but with a different set of pages. The printer compared it to his own copies. There were large differences, yet the underlying design was the same. Another sequence of letters, another name. Someone was still using his craft as part of their mechanism of vengeance. All the precision he once took pride in, the care, the discipline, the exactness, now felt like a curse. He knew every metal character, every tiny groove, and each page carried traces of his hands. Fear grew deeper, but beneath it flickered a strange resolve. A need to understand the truth completely, even if the price was heavy. At night, he sometimes heard footsteps outside. Perhaps it was only a passerby, but it felt as if someone was watching. Just before dawn, when the fog clung to the cobblestones, he would step into the courtyard and stare at the wet stones. Everything, the sky, the city, seemed thinner, more fragile, as if the world itself had lost its solidity. He remembered William's old words about printing. Every line must be straight, or the entire sentence collapses. Now he saw another meaning there. Life, like typeset words, depends on sequence. Make one mistake, and the meaning twists into a nightmare. His mistake was trusting the customer, printing something he did not understand, and now it could not be undone. He continued searching for patterns, writing possible keys, making lists. His handwriting shook with exhaustion. Sometimes he fell asleep at the desk. The workshop transformed into a cage with walls made of paper rustle, ink fumes, and shadows of fear. Fleet Street, meanwhile, continued its bustling life. Newspaper, boys shouted headlines, students hurried by, clerks carried bundles of documents. No one imagined that in a tiny workshop a man was unraveling a mystery that might decide someone else's life. The printer sank deeper into the labyrinth that had begun as a simple order and had turned into something far darker. By now, it was too late to turn back. London followed its own laws. Days and nights blurred like ink on damp paper. After the first murders, rumors spread quickly. Newsboys shouted about an elusive killer, the poetic murderer, as they now called him. Fleet Street echoed with lines from the mysterious booklet, unaware that those lines had been set in type by a single man who no longer knew whom to trust or what to do. To others, it was just another frightening story. To the printer, it was a night tightening around. He worked silently, barely leaving the shop. Orders dwindled. Clients were hesitant. No one wanted to be involved with someone rumored to be connected to a scandal. Paper gathered dust. The ink thickened in its tins. The air smelled of oil and old metal. Eleonora tried to bring him back to life, but he had withdrawn, as if he had lost the ability to hear others. At night, he turned the same proof sheets over and over, feeling as if something in them was alive, watching him. At dawn, he sat by the window, watching the street lamps fade into the fog. He felt, not thought, but felt that a third murder was close. And indeed, a few days later, policemen walked down Fleet Street, knocking on doors. Inspector Hargraves, a middle-aged man with a face like a funeral statue, knocked on the workshop door. The conversation was short. Hargraves asked if he knew anything about a strange booklet of poems. For the first time, the printer understood that his secret was no longer his alone. He tried to stay calm, but his voice trembled with fatigue. The inspector listened quietly, his eyes steady even when the printer admitted that he had printed the booklet without knowing its meaning. Hargraves replied dryly, "Every craftsman is responsible for his work, even when he does not understand what it becomes." The sentence struck like a blade. The inspector did not say whether he suspected him, but his look suggested he saw not a criminal, but a victim who had not yet realized his fate. After that, fear became impossible. More than once he noticed the workshop door slightly open, though he was certain he had locked it. One evening, he found a fresh sheet of paper lying on his doorstep. Just one line printed on it, the same line from the very pamphlet he had once set in type. The ink was still wet, as if someone had left it only seconds before. Someone knew about his involvement, and someone was playing with him. Eleanor cried more often now. What frightened her was not only the growing rumors of the murders, but the man her husband had become, a shadow with hollow eyes, worn down by sleepless nights. She begged him to stop, to leave the city at least for a while. But he stayed silent. Inside him, two forces fought endlessly, the fear of danger creeping toward his family. and the burning need to understand what exactly he had unleashed the moment he pulled the lever of his printing press and brought the murderer's words to life. At night, he dismantled the pamphlet again and again, drawing diagrams, lists, tables, searching for connections between letters, numbers, and pages. And one night, he found a pattern that chilled him. If you read the last line of each page diagonally, a message appeared. Hints, dates, street names. He checked the newspapers and saw they matched the crime scenes exactly. In that moment he understood. The killer was using the printed word not as a game, but as a weapon. Soon, the third murder shook London. This time, it happened almost beside the print shop, in a narrow alley where the rubbish bins stood in the damp shadows. The victim, a middle-aged paper seller he knew by name. In the man's pocket, they found yet another version of the same pamphlet. There was no doubt any more. Despair swallowed him. Might make him the prime suspect. That night, leaning heavily on the press, he wondered, should I destroy it all? Break the forms, burn the proofs, pour the ink into the gutter? But he stopped himself. A printer cannot destroy his press, just as a carpenter cannot destroy the tree. It would be like killing a part of himself. In desperation, he went again to William. The old master greeted him coldly. The office smelled of expensive tobacco and the faint ash of old, forgotten papers. He told William everything, the order, the deaths, the strange symbols. For a brief moment, something like fear flickered across William's face and vanished just as quickly. The master rose, looked him directly in the eyes, and said quietly that it was better not to interfere in things one did not fully understand. His tone was not caution, but warning. When the printer tried to insist, William cut him off sharply. You imagine too much. Sometimes a word is just a word, but returning home, the printer felt it. Something between them had changed forever. Not indifference, but a hidden threat had sounded in his teacher's voice. At home, Eleanor withdrew into silence. Their son was sick with a cold. The house smelled of warm herbs she brewed to bring down his fever. The printer came home at night, left money on the table, asked for forgiveness without truly expecting any. Her patience was thinning. And yet, when he finally told her that the deaths were linked to the pamphlet, she grew pale and whispered only 2 words. Burn it. He could not. That night, he sat by the window, watching the lanterns tremble in the wind. In his hand, he held a proof of the last line. The letters seemed to move. He knew he was losing the boundary between sleep and waking, but he could no longer stop. Eventually, he met with Hargraves again. The inspector listened calmly, without interrupting. Reports, photographs, crime scene notes lay scattered on the desk. Hargraves asked why he had come to him. The printer answered softly, because I feel responsible. The inspector nodded. Responsibility is the first step toward atonement, but not toward salvation. After that, Hargraves began visiting the workshop. At first it unnerved him. Then it became almost normal. A strange bond grew between them, wordless, imperfect, but necessary. The printer shared his observations, showed copies of the pages. The inspector wrote everything down silently. Soon, they both realized the trail led back to William's old connections. The man who ordered the pamphlet might be tied to underground publications from 20 years ago, texts about retribution and purification. The murders were part of a long-delayed revenge. Meanwhile, his family life collapsed completely. Eleanor took their son and left for her relatives. Before going, she said quietly, "You love printing more than the living." He didn't answer. When the door closed, he felt not pain, but an empty, hollow quiet, as if her departure had already happened inside him long before. Now, only the workshop remained, the fog outside, and the ticking of the clock steady, merciless, like sheets of paper sliding through the rollers, never returning to their original form. After they left, his work changed. He no longer printed orders. He searched only for truth. Hargraves brought old reports, documents of a secret society that once gathered on London's outskirts. Merchants, printers, financiers who swore oaths of silence before their world collapsed in scandal. Many lost everything. Many were imprisoned. And now someone was avenging the past. The printer understood. The orderer of the pamphlet might not be the killer himself, but a messenger, a thread in a larger loom, and perhaps someone from the old printing circles, someone who knew that history. While William, the thought felt sacrilegious. His mentor, the man he once trusted, now stood like a dark silhouette from the past. One evening, Hargraves brought a photograph. In his younger years, William had worked in another print shop, one known for political pamphlets. One client vanished without a trace after a scandal. More and more threads pulled toward him. The next morning, the printer went to William's house. The old master opened the door as if he were expecting him. The tension was thick. The printer asked directly whether William was connected to the man who ordered the pamphlet. William only smiled faintly and said, "We are all connected, some through blood, some through type." The printer understood then. The truth was in plain sight. But proving it would be impossible. He returned to his workshop and continued decoding the symbols. Every layer revealed something new, phrases, hints, dates, until he reached a point where the text formed a clear instruction, the place and time of the next murder. A futuron, a murder not yet committed. It struck him suddenly. Maybe the killer wanted to be understood. Maybe every death was an invitation, a conversation written in ink. He told Hargraves. The inspector listened for a long time, then said quietly, "If we know the time and place, we can stop the next one." A silent alliance was formed then, the printer burdened with guilt, and the policeman chasing order. The next days passed in trembling anticipation. The printer barely ate, barely slept. His mind wove meaning into threads, into patterns. He began to sense differences between the fonts, like differences between voices. Some letters seemed to whisper. And yet, within the madness, clarity slowly emerged. He understood now. The murders were happening because of a debt, a long-forgotten one. A debt twisted into a final reckoning. Those who died were all tied, in one way or another, to old betrayals, men who once cheated partners, forged papier, ruined livelihoods in the shadows of the printing and trading world. Everything, absolutely everything, revolved around an old balance, transformed over the years into vengeance. But knowing the pattern brought him no comfort. It struck his mind like the ceaseless clank of the press lever, rhythmic, inevitable, and impossible to escape. Sometimes, when he looked at the printing press, he felt as if he were staring into a mirror that reflected the killer. One created words, the other created death. Both left marks that could not be washed away. One night, while returning from the precinct, after another long conversation with Hargraves, he felt a presence behind him. Soft steps, steady, following him from Fleet Street all the way toward his home. He quickened his pace, then suddenly turned. No one. Only the glistening stone pavement, wet under the lamplight, shimmering like a blade. That night he understood something terrifying. He was no longer an observer. He was inside the game now. And the stakes were too high for retreat. London lay swallowed in fog, thick like a blanket thrown over the city. Sounds were muffled, swallowed by the grey. He walked home through the cold, thick air, listening to the soft squelch of mud beneath his boots, and silently prayed for dawn. For answers, for anything. But morning only revealed the same empty streets, and the same dull sky stretching above the rooftops. Something inside him finally cracked. Life would never return to what it had been. It existed only to observe, to understand, he felt it, though he had no idea what it would cost. Winter arrived suddenly, in one breath. Overnight, Fleet Street lay under a soft sheet of snow, quieting even the metallic scent of lead. People hurried through the whiteness, each step brushing away traces of their deeds. The city felt like a stone beast, frozen mid-movement, watching everything with ancient eyes. In Tosdai, Pinfin frozen, life slowed around him. But his mind did not. The third murder, the one committed so close to his own workshop, had changed everything. Life began unraveling, his friendships, the few orders he still received. And worst of all, his belief that a craftsman could remain separate from the sins born of his craft. London hummed with speculation, and though his name was never spoken aloud, people whispered it. He stopped greeting colleagues, stopped entering bookshops. Everything that once defined his trade now felt poisoned. Hargraves visited more frequently, always without uniform, as if trying to appear merely an acquaintance. But their conversations increasingly resembled interrogations. No threats, no raised voices. Yet every phrase from the inspector sounded like a carefully set trap. He studied the metal plates, the fingerprints, the stray marks of ink. He asked who else might have touched the press. The printer answered honestly, even knowing those answers might turn against him. Still, something like a fragile partnership formed between them. The police had no answers. And Hargraves saw in him not a suspect, but a key. He brought old records, rosters of printing guilds, lists of craftsmen who had fallen from grace to decades earlier. The more they spoke, the clearer it became. The victims were all tied to a single guild, a group once disgraced for financial fraud and document forgery. A scandal had swallowed them. Some were imprisoned, others vanished. But there had been a son, a young man whose father was among the ruined. He disappeared as well, and now Hargreaves believed he had returned. To the printer, this theory sounded like judgment, final and cold. He remembered William's old remark, half joking back then, a print shop is a place where guilt can be sold like any other product. Back then, it seemed like philosophy. Now, it felt like prophecy. For the pamphlet, the killer's chosen signal was also a product. Pressed, cut, finished, perfect. History, he realized, can be printed too. Only the ink changes. Eleanor never wrote. He didn't know where she was, still with her parents, hors Farbillon. The silence between them remained the only constant. It brought both relief and shame. In the evenings, he sat by the window, imagining what he could possibly say to her. How to explain why he hadn't burned the pamphlet at the first sign of danger. Why he hadn't stopped. The but back then, he still bore the power of current escape. He took any legitimate orders, just to keep his hands busy. Printing became ritual again. Pour ink, level the plate, pull the lever, automatic, thoughtless, yet even that held meaning. While the press lived, he felt the world remained intact, if silence fell. The thoughts would consume him completely. One evening, Hargreaves entered without knocking. There was a strange expression on his face, a mix of exhaustion and cold triumph. He held a sealed envelope. Inside, a new pamphlet. The fourth, another victim. A bookseller from Kensington. Anticopy partially printed with type from William's workshop. The printer felt his blood turn to ice. If William had been involved, knowingly or unknowingly, then everything circled back to the place where it began. He went to him that very night. The master was awake, lanterns burning in the workshop. The conversation was strained. He asked why William had not told him he was printing the same text. William replied sharply, evasively, "You see patterns where there is only chance," but his eyes darted away. His voice trembled beneath the firm words. He was defending something. Then the printer noticed it, a proof sheet, with the same spelling error that appeared only in the very first pamphlet. The world seemed to collapse inward. William Adelped Weatherly. Or with terrible understanding. Stunned, the printer stepped into the snowy street. The cold bit into his skin. On the corner stood Hargreaves. One look at the printer's face told the inspector everything. The next day, they searched William's workshop together. They found boxes of plates and manuscripts, many identical to the ones used in the killer's pamphlet. But William himself was gone, his home left open. Like a book with the last page torn out. From that moment, everything shifted. Hargreaves no longer hid his request. "You know the hands and eyes of printers better than any of us. Help us understand these forms. Help us trace them." And the printer agreed. Perhaps it was guilt. Or perhaps the unspoken need to see the story through. Whatever the reason, the investigation became his new craft. Where cases of metal type once lay on his table, there were now reports, diagrams, torn fragments of newspapers. He bent over them the way he once bent over a fresh sheet of paper sliding into the press, patient, meticulous, absorbed. He studied the impressions under a magnifying glass, measured the spacing between letters, traced the tiny irregularities in the ink. he noticed what the police could not. Every font, every imperfect line, every microscopic scratch on the metal. They all carried the unmistakable signature of the printer who had touched them. And one day, he discovered something that could finally break the case open in the fourth pamphlet. The letter A had a faint fracture at its base, a hairline crack, so small, so specific, that only someone who lived inside the craft would ever see it. He knew that crack. It had appeared years ago, back in the days when he and William worked in their half-underground workshop. He had once tried to repair it, but ultimately left the flawed typepiece in storage, hidden deep within a private drawer. Someone had retrieved it. Someone who knew exactly where it was kept, someone who understood its history. Who, besides William, could possibly have known? Hargraves listened in silence, but in his eyes, for the first time, flickered a shadow of doubt, as if he suddenly considered that the murderer might not be acting alone, that perhaps this revenge was orchestrated by one mind, carried out by several hands. The printer couldn't accept or reject the idea. William might have been a messenger or a pawn, but someone else stood behind him. The following weeks blurred into a feverish haze. He hardly slept, and when sleep finally dragged him down, he dreamed of a spinning press where ink turned into blood with each revolution. Every night, noise felt like an approaching ending. Yet fear no longer ruled him the way it once had. Suffering had sharpened into purpose. If he was a printer, then he was destined to bring this story to its final imprint, even if the price was his life. Meanwhile, the city boiled with unrest. Newspapers wrote of a night preacher of retribution. Each death fed the panic. People began fearing that guilt itself was a mark that could condemn anyone, because in London, who could truly claim innocence? Through the thin walls of his shop, he heard arguments from the taverns, debates about justice, forgiveness, the hidden sins of merchants and craftsmen. And he understood. Printed words had once again become a weapon, only now they were aimed not at power, but at conscience. A fifth pamphlet appeared a week later. Inside, a new cipher. Numbers highlighted in the titles formed a sequence. After hours of debate, he and Hargraves finally deciphered it, a street name and a date. The killer was preparing another strike. Their decision came quickly. They would set a trap. The night was freezing. Windows glowed like dim squares cut into the darkness. The streets lay empty and brittle under the cold. He and Hargraves waited, still as statues. Hours passed, silent and heavy. Then a silhouette. A man in a long coat, holding a bundle of papers. He glanced around and placed the bundle on a doorstep. At that moment, policeman's shadow. Everything dissolved into shouts, footsteps, chaos. The printer stood frozen, watching as the figure was dragged toward the lamplight. It was not the murderer. It was Thomas Craven, the writer who had once brought him the very first illicit texts. His face was gaunt, his eyes dim and unfocused. Hargraves commanded the officers to hold him, but Thomas murmured, his voice dull and hollow, "I only carried the words." "They aren't mine." The printer stepped forward, unable to believe what he heard. The days that followed were filled with interrogations. Craven admitted to distributing the pamphlets. He claimed he had received the manuscripts from a man who promised to expose the old crimes of the Craftsmen's Guild. A thin log fire cracked In the police station, as Hargraves read the testimony aloud, the patron's name was withheld. Only a cryptic description, someone who knows the price of paper and the weight of a word. That was all they needed to understand. It was someone from their own world, one of those who once printed secret leaflets and hid compromising texts in the dark. Corners of old workshops. Thomas was imprisoned, but the case did not rest. The next day, a grim report arrived in the docks. They had found a body. William. His death looked like suicide. A single note was left behind, a crushed piece of paper, bearing lines formed from phrases in the very first pamphlet. It read, "Every letter demands its own reckoning." Hargraves handed the paper to the printer and said softly, "He has paid." The printer said nothing. There was no relief in him, only a hollow, echoing emptiness. Everything felt finished, yet not finished at all. The silence in his workshop resembled the silence of a graveyard. He burned the remaining type pieces, melted the lead, sealed the cases. Every relic of those days vanished in the fire, but the ashes smelled not of cleansing, but of loss. Eleanor returned in spring when the city had finally calmed. She stepped inside quietly, lingered at the doorway, watching him. He sat in the corner, exhausted, older, worn down like an overused plate. She whispered, "The house is empty." "But you are still here." He lifted his eyes, and, for the first time in months, felt warmth inside him. The world seemed to regain its shape, but the unease remained. The crimes had stopped. But the pamphlet's message, its shadow of guilt and reckoning, had imprinted itself inside him. He no longer cared for fame or skill. Now, every printed page felt like a kind of prayer, not to God, but to conscience. Spring sunlight spilled through the windows. Dust drifted lazily in the air, and the press stood silent. He hadn't touched it in weeks. Sometimes he approached it and let his fingertips glide along the cold metal lever, like brushing the gravestone of an old friend. The fog over Fleet Street no longer frightened him. It only reminded him no word ever truly disappears once set in print. Thus ended his journey through fear and betrayal, though not his life's work. From that moment on, every sheet he printed felt like a chance to correct a single line in the long manuscript called life. The city was not the same. After the winter's events, London seemed drained, as if it had exhaled a long, heavy breath. The newspapers stopped writing about the murders. The crowds stopped whispering. His name no longer surfaced in rumors, yet he knew the shadow remained in people's eyes. People rarely forgive the one who reminds them that words can kill. The police closed the case. Inspector Hargraves declared it solved. The culprit identified, the mastermind dead. London could sleep in peace, but neither Hargraves nor the printer. Fundrest. The official account was tidy, neat, like a perfectly justified line of type. But something hollow glimmered beneath its surface. The motive was unclear, the connections uncertain, the truth incomplete. Craven's testimony satisfied the bureaucracy. William's death put a clean full stop to a tangled story. But the printer knew everything was too perfect to be true, like a book bound for display, not for reading. He felt that behind this ending lived a pause, a deliberate silence, and that someone, somewhere, might still be writing a continuation, while he had been left with the ambiguous role of editing a truth he did not fully trust. Spring deepened. The print shop returned to life. But the press sounded different now. Each lever, each thump, echoed through his mind as a painful reminder of what printed words could do. He took orders again. Yet to every customer he now seemed distant, as if standing half a room away, even when There was a time when he would talk endlessly about typefaces, argue gently about the warmth of certain papers, or the softness of ink on the fingertips. Now he simply nodded, agreed, and carried out his tasks, as if the soul had left the craft and the body worked only out of habit. Something essential had vanished from him. That quiet joy of a craftsman who breathes life into every finished page. Eleanor returned for good. Their son had grown. He now knew how to read, how to shape letters into words. In the evenings, the boy sometimes helped his father arrange tiny metal types, as if it were just a game, a small echo of those peaceful years, a reminder of a world untouched by fear. But even that couldn't dispel the shadow that hung over every printed page. Eleanor avoided the past carefully, almost tenderly, as if afraid to disturb its quiet dust. She spoke about food, about neighbors, about the laundry drying near the hearth, but never about the print shop, never about Hargraves, never about William's death. And he was grateful for that silence, like a soft blanket gently covering a wound, without ever touching it. Montpassé. One day, a letter arrived from Hargraves. No official seals, only a heavy, tired handwriting. He asked for a meeting. They met in the suburbs, in a dim little coffee house near the train station. Hargraves looked different. Older, thinner, as though someone had taken a layer of warmth from him. He didn't sit like a man reporting news. He sat like someone seeking absolution. He confessed that the case would not release him. There were new circumstances. Craven, before his death, had whispered things no one took seriously at the time. He had said that the pamphlet listed not only the victims, but the order of their fates, and the last line did not point to death, but to salvation. Someone, it seemed, was meant to survive. This thought tormented the inspector, because the number of deaths did not match the structure of the text. The printer listened without interrupting. He understood perfectly where Hargraves was leading him. There was one more name in the killer's list, never crossed out, if the order was preserved. Then the final, invisible chapter could still be waiting, like a misprinted line that multiplied with every new edition. And from that day, everything began again. Evenings found the printer hunched over old notebooks, those same notebooks he once hid so he could forget. Now he opened them to search, to see what he had once missed. He sensed that the pamphlets held something else, a hidden sequence buried in typographic details, in the broken letters, in the spacing of the lines, in the rhythm of the print. It wasn't just poetry, and not only cipher, it was a memory. A map of old debts set in typefaces of different eras. As if the text itself had been built from fragments of other people's lives. Every formula has rhythm, and soon he began to feel that rhythm everywhere, in the clatter of the press, in his son's footsteps, in the whisper of the roof during rain. It felt as if everything around him was speaking, and he was the only one who could hear it. But the more he listened, the more clearly he sensed his life was turning back into a page of type, arranged by an unseen hand. Hargraves visited rarely, but every conversation grew darker. The inspector finally admitted one evening that he feared the events might repeat themselves. Both Mendersidnating, buta son idea. A man can die, but the idea wasn't there. They searched the archives of the Craftsmen's Society mentioned in earlier documents. Among the brittle pages, they found a meeting log from Zhou, 11 laatste page of name. Many were crossed out, but one name remained untouched. Beside it, a note, heir to the work, no address. On lia symboliser, a mark once used to label practice sheets for apprentices. Left alone, the printer remembered William. A master could be both guilty and innocent, a victim and perpetrator. Because their trade dealt with dangerous things, ideas, secrets, truth sharpened like blades. William had simply lost the border between word and deed, so easily blurred in their craft. Exactly 1 year after the last events, a boy came to his door with a letter. No sandé. Inside, half a page of a pamphlet, printed with new type. The text was different, but the spacing and rhythm mimicked the old style. And at the bottom, the press awaits completion. Blood froze in his veins. His first thought was mistake. A cruel de joc. But the deeper part of his mind whispered something colder. Someone was continuing the work. He took a magnifying lens. He saw the tiny imperfections, uneven pressure, a sloppy roller, misaligned lines. The work of a beginner, not a master. Butatouan teared him. But those who saw the idea and mistook it for a calling. The printer felt nausea rise, not from fear, but from shame. The printer insisted on confronting him, first, not as an officer, but as a fellow craftsman. Only a printer could truly speak to another printer. Inside, a young man, barely 20, stood over a press, holding a sheet still wet with black ink. Who taught you? He died believing that the truth, if printed bravely enough, could restore justice. Herr but he felt, suddenly and painfully. They will only be reborn where someone is ready to hear. His duty was no longer to erase. The young man listened as he explained the simplest, hardest truth. No temple. When the morning sun finally rose, the young man carried all the printing forms outside and threw them into the river. Hargreaves did not approve. The inspector would sometimes joke that after everything they'd been through, both of them had become part of a chronicle that no one would ever read. The printer would smile. Life flowed into a quieter rhythm, but one night he awoke to the sound of printing again. A lamp was burning in the next room, its gentle smoke curling upward. His son was standing at the type cases, arranging letters with careful, excited fingers. The boy looked over his shoulder, guilty and shy. He said he just wanted to try. In his hands was a small test print, neat, clean, with simple words. The world can be reset again. He didn't scold him. He simply sat the boy beside him and showed how to press the sheet evenly so the ink settled like soft shadow across the paper. The pause between generations quietly disappeared. A print shop for all who seek meaning. Sometimes he saw a newspaper in Hargreaves' hands using his old typeface, and it filled him with a strange, warm satisfaction. Another winter passed. In the evenings he spoke to his students about the past, telling it without names, without fear, like describing an old typecase where every letter is cracked. Yet the text is still readable. Spring returned, and Fleet Street hummed outside his window once more. But now, he no longer feared this endless cycle. And yet, the echo of those years still clung to him. But his eyes stayed clear, attentive, searching every movement around him, as if he was comparing each gesture with some old memory of type and ink. Now apprentices worked there, their energy quick and loud. Orders came constantly from the municipality, from schools, from shopkeepers. People trusted his work again, and although the old maker S mark was gone from every sheet, as if he no longer wanted his name to mean anything more than simply good paper, his presence lingered in every sharp, precise line. Inspector Hargreaves had aged as well. Between the lines, there was worry. All of them disturbingly similar to the ones from years ago. It would have been easy to dismiss them as cheap imitation, if not for one detail. At one crime scene, they found a fragment of a printing form used for small pamphlets. When Hargreaves arrived in person, the 5th day of spring, rain was falling steadily, like a slow heartbeat against the roof. The inspector entered without ceremony, removed his hat, sighed, and placed something on the table, a strip of brass letters. The printer touched it lightly, and immediately knew it wasn't a copy. One letter had a tiny chip, the same one he remembered from childhood, when he had accidentally dropped a type case in William's shop. They sat for a long time, listening to the rain tapping softly over their heads. Hargreaves explained. Those forms were found in the basement of an old house on Fleet Street, recently purchased by an unknown businessman. In his pocket lay a miniature book, thin, precise, printed in a typeface the printer knew painfully well. A cold understanding rose inside him. A word released into the world never dies. It searches for someone through whom it can continue to live. He once believed one could be saved through labor alone. But memory turned into print can become dangerous. The police had identified him, Thomas Craven, or rather, his son. The old writer had died in prison years after the trial, never seeing daylight again. No one knew he had a son, born in poverty, raised perhaps on the same ideas that destroyed his father, The printer felt bitterness rising into his throat. He too could have become such a son, if his life had been guided not by work, but by revenge. The next day they walked to Fleet Street. The house stood apart from the lively shops, a stone building with narrow, dirt-streaked windows. The courtyard smelled of dampness and paper. The workshop inside was simple: an old press, drawers of type, stacks of uncut sheets. A single lamp lit the table, beside it fresh forms. Everything looked harmless, until he picked up one sheet and saw the familiar pattern. The same columns of letters, the same strange rhythm, only without names. Suddenly, footsteps, a young man, 20 perhaps, entered, and he did not look afraid. His face resembled Craven's, the same direct gaze, the same mixture of stubbornness and quiet despair. The printer understood at once who stood before him. Hargreaves tried to act formally, asking for the young man's name, demanding explanations. But the youthly almost kindly. His voice was calm, steady. "I'm correcting," he said. "Everything they began. I want to finish it." Properly, this time, he pointed to the sheets on the table. Retsnauau, Noiden almost like prayers. Words about forgiveness, about difficult times, about people searching for truth through the written word. While the inspector flipped through the pages, the printer stepped toward the press. He knew every sound, the steady rhythm of the lever, the metal click of the form, the faint sigh of the inking roller. Everything was repeating itself. And yet, it wasn't the same. The ink, glowing on the paper, had a softer tone, almost warm. The young man had mixed it from ash and oil, a strange, gentle mixture. Asifa Veune, the new master of this old press, wished for it, but Hargreaves grew dark. Among them the fades, a fundot hidner. These sheets were different. They did not speak of forgiveness. They formed names, names of living editors, officials, men who had once taken part in the trial of Thomas Craven. The list looked painfully familiar, no different from the lists of victims long ago. The printer understood. This young man was torn, caught between two worlds, the desire to correct and the pull of revenge. Their conversation stretched for hours. Hargreaves insisted he stop printing. But the young man replied calmly, "As long as I print the truth, I am alive." Then he turned to the printer and whispered, "You, too, once told the world something you could not remain silent about." Those words struck deeper than any accusation. The printer tried to speak about the cost of the written word, that truth printed in blood cannot cleanse anything. It only multiplies pain. But the young man stood firm. When Hargreaves tried to seize the forms, he tore away, clutching the bundle to his chest. In the chaos, in the thuds, the clatter, the trembling of the room, a sharp crack rang out. The old printing press, worn from years of labor, collapsed. Metal bent, the frame split, and part of the form shattered with it. Dust rose in a soft cloud. Then, silence. The printer lifted himself slowly, coughing. Hargreaves was examining the room. The young man sat on the floor, staring at the broken iron. He no longer struggled. It felt as if the machine itself had decided to place the final punctuation mark. Everything that might have been printed, all of it disappeared now, lost in the dimness of the workshop, swallowed by the warm smoke of the lamp. At the door, Hargreaves murmured, He witnessed a new generation of craftsmen treating words with care, as though they understood the weight each letter carried. Every book that left their press now opened with an epigraph chosen by his son. The word labors faithfully when a person approaches it with belief, not pride. The printer aged. His hands ached, his eyes failed, but he continued to come to the workshop. Sometimes he simply sat quietly, listening to the sound of young hands filling type cases, to the gentle rustle of paper. Those sounds had become his prayer. Eleanor watched him soften, watched the harshness of his youth melt away into calmness. From time to time, the young man, Craven's son, visited him. He came in clean clothes, bringing printed sheets with simple texts for schools. His eyes no longer burned with fanatic fire. They held sadness and gratitude. He called the printer teacher. They would sit together by the press and speak about the craft, about how important it is to know what you hand to the world through your work. And in those moments, the printer understood. The cycle was complete. The wide streets filled again with the cries of newsboys, the thunder of printing presses, London living in its eternal noise. And within that endless roar, his small workshop sounded quiet, barely noticeable. But to him, that soft sound was life itself, the steady breath after a long silence. Manlis evocadon. Silver light shimmered over the river. Smoke curled slowly beyond the rooftops. He put on his coat, went downstairs, and ran his hand across the old press. The metal was cold, but still alive. He smiled, remembering how this machine once thundered through the night, producing not pamphlets, but destinies. Now everything was different. What remained from the past was only the purity of the craft. He sat at the table, took a stack of white sheets from the drawer, and wrote the final page he planned to print with his apprentices. It was neither confession nor plea, just a quiet reflection of a man who had learned how difficult it is to live between the letter and the meaning. At the end of the text he wrote a single line, "Truth must speak softly, so it does not wound." By noon, the apprentices entered and found him asleep at the table. A faint smile rested on his lips. On the press, a fresh print was drying, clean, even, perfect. The last work of the old master, the paper smelled of ink and peace. Mist rose outside the window, slow and gentle as always. No signs, no loud proclamations. Only a quiet city, holding the memory of a man who turned his inner guilt into strength and made of it a craft. It seemed as though the air over Fleet Street carried a barely audible rhythm, steady like the movement of a printing lever. And within that rhythm lived a quiet life that nothing could ever command. The house stood on a calm street just off bustling Fleet Street, yet the morning sounds of the city still reached its windows, the metal hum of presses, the shouts of paper boys, the clatter of hooves, all of it blending into a single familiar melody of London. The printer no longer leapt to his feet each morning. Days flowed slowly now, without hurry. New bookshops replaced old stalls. The world was becoming something new, and that no longer troubled him. He lived with Eleanor and his son, now around 20. The young man inherited his father's calmness, but not his gloom. He laughed often, worked willingly, and was unafraid of mistakes in the type. Sometimes they sat together in the old workshop. The room no longer brought profit. It was now a sanctuary for quiet evenings. In the corner, stood the press, heavy and motionless like a guardian of ancient craft. Dust shimmered over its iron rollers, but when the sun pulled the machine still answered the gentle, steady motion. Life had become quiet. On Besidit, Frappred, from bakery next door, Eleanor read the newspaper, where the works of his former apprentices sometimes appeared. There was a gentle pride living in her eyes. They rarely spoke of the past. It no longer bit at them, no longer woke them in the night, no longer returned as nightmares. The past had turned into the faint rustle of pages already read to the end. Sometimes, when the fog drifted low outside the window, but his stride remained steady. He loved looking at the water as if it were a mirror. Only movement and light. The river remembered nothing. He wrote rarely now, printed even more rarely. Books lay scattered on the table, newspaper clippings, an inkwell, and a whole stack of old letters. Among them was one left unopened. The handwriting was unmistakable. Hargreaves had sent it a few days before his death. Everything inside him urged him to break the seal, yet he never did. No out of. Some words must remain unspoken. Long ago, he thought the purpose of life. The meaning lives in the silence left between the lines. Chasing that invisible balance between line and thought. Asmujo. Perfection, he understood, is dead. In the evenings, they dined together, the three of them. He dreamed of publishing not only textbooks, but also the works of young authors. The printer listened carefully, but did not interfere. He knew that every era has its own word, and that the younger generation has no need for the advice of the old. Eleanor would sometimes sit beside him, touching his hand. Her face had grown softly lined, but her eyes were the same ones that had once looked upon a carpenter in love with his press. She no longer asked about the years when he nearly lost himself, no longer reminded him of seals and trials. They lived their lives like a long book one does not wish to reread, yet is reluctant to close. One evening, his son brought home a sample of a new stamp from the printing house. On the white field, above the neat company font, stood a line. Every word answers only to the conscience of the one who printed it. He showed it to his father, expecting approval. The old man read it slowly and smiled. It was a short phrase, but a precise one. He ran his finger across the letters and felt an unexpected tremor rise in his chest, a mixture of joy and peace. Everything he had once taught now lived in others. Sometimes, on rare lonely days, He returned in thought to that darkness, to the pamphlet, to William, to Hargreaves, to the young man who printed revenge. Noit Bambus dream, every changed. The horrors no longer frightened him, for there was nothing unknown in them any more. Even death now seemed like the sound of a press coming to a stop to make room for the next mechanism. His son often asked him to tell stories of his youth, but the printer did not like decorating life with fiction. He spoke in simple words. I made more mistakes than choices, but mistakes were what guided me, and when his son laughed, he would add, for the one who sets type, remembering is everything. The deeper the mark, the stronger the imprint. At dawn, he often woke to the sound of dripping. The old gutter beneath the window dripped onto the metal sill in an even rhythm. It was the same rhythm as the printing press turning the sheets. City sounds wove themselves into his imagination, footsteps on the wet cobblestones, the creak of carts, the horns of steamers at the docks. All of it seemed like the continuation of the same music in which his life had once resounded. In the spring vinyl book, the text was simple, notes on the craft. Not memoirs, not confessions, but advice for those who would carry the line forward. He wrote of typecases, paper, ink mixtures, of patience. But between the paragraphs flowed philosophy. A word must not only speak, it must listen. Sometimes he smiled at himself. His own mentor had spoken the same way, and he had never understood him. Now he understood everything. The book took months. He did not rush. He set each chapter by hand. Slowly, but his hand still remembered the meaning of pressure. The press creaked, but obeyed. The paper absorbed each word. He did not put dates on the prints, and decided the first copies would be gifts for his apprentices. One day, the paper delivery was delayed, and he walked to his son's printing house himself. Seeing the new machines, fast and soulless, he felt a strange irritation. The machines stole from a human the silence that lives between the lever's blows. Everything was too fast, as if time were overtaking meaning. His son noticed his expression and said quietly, "The world moves forward. But the letters are still yours." The printer nodded. He understood. One cannot judge time with an old gaze. His era had ended. Now it was important not to silence the new one. One evening, on his way home, he stopped by the window of a bookshop. Under the glass lay a volume with a grey cover. The title spoke of the printing craft and of the human being. The print run was small. The author, one of his former students. He took the book into his hands, flipped through the pages until he found familiar lines. The same thoughts he had once spoken aloud in the workshop. The same stories of old William, of the printer who had printed ruin and salvation at once. Everything had blended together, turned into legend. His name was not there, and he was grateful for that. He bought a copy, brought it home, and placed it on the shelf, not as a memory of himself, but as proof that honest labor travels farther than the body ever can. That night, he sat for a long time, in the dark, listening to the distant thunder of printing presses like enormous beating hearts. Later, in the summer, when the garden was covered in late flowers, he stopped approaching the press. His son printed without him, asking only sometimes for his father to check the proofs. The old man would put on his glasses, inspect each sheet carefully, and smooth the edges with his finger. "Good," he would say. "You have learned steady breathing. Now the print will hold. Eleanor sat by the window, sewing. Her face glowed in the light of the oil lamp. The room held that special silence that comes when all words have already been said. The sun would fall quiet. The old man would set aside his glasses, and the evening flowed. As if time hesitated to disturb their peace. One day, a young typesetter from the Sun's printing house came to the house with news. A large publishing house had opened in the capital and was searching for experienced craftsmen. The Sun said he might leave. The old man did not object. Each person chooses where his line ends, he said. Just do not place the period too early. The Sun embraced him tightly, not as a tired old man, but as an equal. Their farewell lasted several days. They walked the city together, remembering shops, bridges, the old walls. Fleet Street, like any beating heart of a city, rumbled on, young, restless, indifferent. Where William's printing house once stood, there was now a tea-house. In the side alleys, the same footsteps, the same smell, the same shoot as if a siertree hast. The old man stood at the tea-house threshold and said quietly, "We were once a part of this street. Now this street is a part of us. When his son left, the house did not grow empty. Onze contrarie, the air became clearer, as if life itself were preparing for peace." The old man woke at dawn, drank his tea, and reread the book that stood on the shelf. Every word answered him with kindness. It was the road he had walked to its end. His death was quiet, like everything else in his life. Eleanor found him in the morning, sitting at the table, a page open before him. On it were printed lines about forgiving one's mistakes. A beam of sunlight fell across the sheet as if underlining the words. The paper still smelled of fresh ink. The funeral was simple. Apprentices came, neighbors, a few printers. His son had managed to return. He stood holding that very last impression. There, in smaltype, were the words, "Everyone who prints leaves an imprint, not on paper, but on a human being." No one knew when he had found the time to set that page. After the funeral, the son left the old press where it was. He did not move it, did not repair it. He only brushed the dust from the lever, as though touching his father's hand. Sometimes, in the early morning, he entered the workshop, sat at the table, and listened to the distant sounds of presses awakening on the far side of the city. And in those moments, it seemed as if this vast world was nothing more than one endless typeset, where every life becomes a line, and every mistake a chance to begin the word again. And somewhere inside that steady hum, old London, Fleet Street, the smell of ink. And the footsteps of printers still carried the breath of one man who had managed to turn even the heaviest pages of his life into peace.